The day my boss mocked my tears was the day I started collecting evidence. After 3 years of her belittling comments, I finally understood that her behavior wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. And nobody saw the storm coming, especially not her. Before we dive in, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious if workplace bullying looks the same no matter where or when you're experiencing it. For me, it started on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:17 a.m. I still remember clutching the printed email in my hand as I knocked on Sandra's office door. My grandmother had passed away the night before, and I needed to request bereavement leave for the funeral in Ohio. I had prepared myself to be professional, to keep my emotions in check until I could get back to my desk. But when Sandra glanced up from her computer with that perpetual look of annoyance, something inside me cracked. "What is it now, Melissa?" she asked, not even bothering to hide her impatience. "I need to request bereavement leave," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "My grandmother passed away last night. The funeral is on Friday in Cincinnati." Sandra sighed as if I'd asked her for a month-long vacation in the Bahamas. Again, "Didn't you just take time off last month for some family thing?" That family thing had been my sister's wedding, which I'd scheduled my vacation days around 6 months in advance. "This is different," I said, feeling the first tear escape despite my best efforts. "It's bereavement leave. It's in the company policy." Sandra leaned back in her chair, eyes rolling toward the ceiling. "God, Melissa, you cry too easily. It's always something with you." I froze, tears now flowing freely down my cheeks. In that moment, with grief already crushing my chest, her words hit like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," I whispered, hating myself for apologizing. "Fine," she snapped, waving her hand dismissively. "Take Thursday and Friday. But I need that Henderson report before you leave." The Henderson report wasn't due for another 2 weeks. We both knew that. "Thank you," I said, automatically backing out of her office. As I wiped my tears at my desk, I noticed Diane from accounting watching me with sympathetic eyes. It wasn't the first time someone had witnessed Sandra's treatment of me, but it was the first time I felt something beyond shame or sadness. I felt anger, clear, sharp, and surprisingly energizing. That night, instead of just crying into my pillow, I opened my laptop and started a document. At the top, I typed, "Incidents with Sandra Collins." I began with that day's interaction, recording every detail I could remember, including Diane as a potential witness. Then I worked backward, documenting every belittling comment, every unreasonable deadline, every instance where Sandra had singled me out for criticism in front of others. By the time I finished, it was nearly 2 a.m., and I had 7 pages of incidents spanning the 3 years I'd worked under her. 7 pages of subtle harassment that, when viewed individually, might seem like tough management, but collectively painted a clear pattern of targeted bullying. I slept better that night than I had in months. At my grandmother's funeral, surrounded by family sharing stories of her kindness and strength, I made a decision. I would no longer absorb Sandra's treatment as if I deserved it. My grandmother had raised 3 children alone after my grandfather died, had worked 2 jobs to put my mother through college, had never allowed anyone to diminish her worth. I owed it to her memory and to myself to stand up. When I returned to work on Monday, Sandra didn't even acknowledge my loss. Instead, she criticized the Henderson report I'd stayed up all night to complete before leaving for the funeral. "The data visualization is all wrong," she said during the morning team meeting, displaying my report on the projector for everyone to see. "This is elementary stuff, Melissa. Did you even try?" I had spent hours on those visualizations, following the exact format Sandra had approved for the last quarterly report. "I used the same format as the Q3 report," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Well, it was wrong then too," she snapped. "But I didn't have time to fix your mistakes. This time I do." As she continued to dissect my work in front of our team, I opened my document and added this incident, typing discreetly as she spoke. When I glanced up, I caught Kevin, our newest team member, looking at me with a furrowed brow. He seemed confused by the disconnect between Sandra's criticism and the report everyone could clearly see was thoroughly professional. After the meeting, Kevin stopped by my desk. "Hey, is she always like that with you?" he asked in a low voice. I hesitated, not wanting to seem like I was bad-mouthing our boss to a new colleague. But I was tired of pretending. "Pretty much," I admitted. Kevin shook his head. "That's not right. At my last job, we had a manager who acted like that. HR eventually got involved." "What happened?" I asked, suddenly very interested. "She was put on probation, had to take management training. Things got better for a while." He shrugged. "I left anyway, but at least she couldn't keep treating people like dirt without consequences." I added Kevin's observations to my document that night, along with the names of 2 other colleagues who had witnessed Sandra's behavior over the years. My document was now becoming something more than just a record of painful memories. It was beginning to feel like evidence. 2 weeks later, my opportunity came in the form of our annual performance reviews. Sandra had scheduled mine for late Friday afternoon, a time slot I recognized as deliberate. No witnesses, and I'd have the whole weekend to cry about whatever she said. I prepared meticulously, bringing a portfolio of my accomplishments, client testimonials, and statistics showing how I'd increased department efficiency by 18% with a workflow redesign I'd implemented. I also brought a small notebook to take notes. Sandra started with a dismissive glance at my portfolio. "Let's not waste time with all that. We both know there have been issues with your performance." "What issues specifically?" I asked, pen poised over my notebook. She seemed taken aback by the direct question. "Well, for one, you're too emotional. You take criticism personally instead of professionally." I wrote that down word for word. "Could you give me a specific example of when my emotions affected my work product?" Sandra frowned, clearly not expecting me to challenge her. "The Henderson report, for one. You were clearly upset about my feedback." I completed the Henderson report early, despite being on bereavement leave," I said calmly. "The client praised the findings and has already implemented 3 of the 5 recommendations. Is there an issue with the actual content or results of my work?" "It's your attitude, Melissa. You're not a team player." I wrote that down too. "Can you provide specific instances where I failed to collaborate effectively with team members?" The meeting continued like this for 45 uncomfortable minutes. With each vague criticism, I asked for specific examples. With each example, I countered with documented results. Sandra grew increasingly frustrated and used to me standing my ground. Finally, she pushed my performance review across the desk. "Just sign it." I looked down at the form where she had given me needs improvement ratings in almost every category, including teamwork and communication. The comments section included phrases like struggles to accept criticism and allows emotions to interfere with professional responsibilities. "I'd like to take this home to review before signing," I said. "That's not how we do things," Sandra said sharply. "You sign now and a copy goes to HR." "Actually," I said, heart pounding but voice steady, "company policy allows employees 48 hours to review their performance evaluations before signing. It's on page 17 of the employee handbook." Sandra's face flushed with anger. "Since when do you care about policy?" "Since I needed bereavement leave to bury my grandmother," I replied, gathering my things. "I'll return this on Monday." When I got home, I didn't cry as Sandra probably expected. Instead, I scanned the performance review and added it to my growing file of evidence. Then I spent the weekend researching workplace harassment laws in our state and drafting a formal complaint to HR. On Monday morning, I arrived at work 30 minutes early and went straight to HR. Janet, the HR director, was already at her desk. "Do you have a minute?" I asked from her doorway. She looked up with a smile. "Of course, Melissa. Come in." I closed the door behind me and placed Sandra's performance review on her desk, along with my own detailed response to each criticism and a printed copy of my documented incidents. I believe I'm being targeted by my manager, Sandra Collins, I said. I've been documenting her behavior for the past few months, and I'd like to file a formal complaint. Janet's smile faded as she glanced at the thickness of my documentation. This is quite thorough. I also have the names of several colleagues who have witnessed these incidents, I added, and I've noticed that 3 women have left our department in the past year. You might want to check their exit interviews. Janet nodded slowly, a look of dawning comprehension crossing her face. I will need to review all of this carefully. Thank you for bringing it to my attention, Melissa. There's one more thing, I said, reaching into my bag to produce a final document. I won't be signing this performance review in its current form. I've prepared a formal rebuttal, which I'd like included in my personnel file. Janet took the rebuttal, looking increasingly concerned. Of course, I'll make sure it's included. As I stood to leave, Janet said, We take these matters very seriously, Melissa. I'll need to speak with Sandra and others as part of my investigation. I understand, I replied. I just want a fair workplace. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in years. Whether or not my complaint resulted in any action against Sandra, I had finally stood up for myself. I had refused to accept her narrative about me as fact. For the next 2 weeks, HR conducted interviews with Sandra, me, and several of our colleagues. I noticed Kevin was called in, as well as Diane from accounting and 2 other team members who had witnessed particularly harsh incidents. Sandra's behavior toward me grew colder, but more careful. No more public criticisms, no more impossible deadlines announced in front of the team. She could feel something shifting, though she didn't yet know what. Then came the meeting that changed everything. Janet from HR asked to see both Sandra and me in the conference room. As we sat across from each other, with Janet at the head of the table, I noticed a man I didn't recognize sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes. Thank you both for coming, Janet began, her tone formal. After a thorough investigation, we found sufficient evidence to support Melissa's complaint of workplace harassment. Sandra's face went white, then red. That's ridiculous. She's just too sensitive. She cries if I so much as... Sandra! Janet cut in sharply. Comments about an employee's emotional responses are exactly the type of behavior cited in the complaint. The man in the corner cleared his throat. Perhaps I should introduce myself, he said. I'm Richard Patel, legal counsel for the company. I've reviewed the documentation and witness statements, and I must advise that the company takes this situation very seriously. Sandra turned to me, her expression a mixture of shock and fury. You're suing me? Over a few tough performance reviews. I met her gaze calmly. I'm not suing anyone. I filed an internal complaint about a hostile work environment. Richard Patel intervened again. However, the documented behavior, if it continued, could potentially expose the company to legal liability, which is why we're addressing it proactively. Janet slid a document across the table to Sandra. This is a formal written warning. You'll be required to complete management training, and we'll be conducting follow-up reviews over the next 6 months. Sandra stared at the document, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for it. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, I saw tears forming in her eyes. This will go in my permanent record, she whispered. Yes, Janet confirmed, as will the results of the follow-up reviews. A single tear slipped down Sandra's cheek as the implications became clear. This would affect any future promotion opportunities, possibly even her current position if she didn't change her management style. As I watched my always composed, always critical boss cry in front of HR and legal counsel, I felt no satisfaction, no vindication. Just a quiet certainty that I'd done the right thing, not just for myself, but for everyone who would work under Sandra in the future. The meeting concluded with specific actions for moving forward. Sandra would remain my supervisor, but all our one-on-one meetings would be documented. My performance review would be conducted by Janet and Sandra's supervisor together at the end of the quarter, and Sandra would begin her management training the following week. As we left the conference room, Sandra quickly wiped her tears and straightened her shoulders, already rebuilding her composure. But something fundamental had changed. The imbalance of power had shifted, and we both knew it. That night, as I added the outcome of the HR investigation to my documentation, I realized I hadn't cried once throughout the entire process. Not when filing the complaint, not during the investigation, not even sitting across from Sandra in that final meeting. It wasn't that I'd stopped feeling emotions. If anything, I felt them more clearly now, unclouded by self-doubt and fear. The difference was that I'd finally recognized my own worth, my right to be treated with basic respect in the workplace. I'd found my voice, and it was steady, clear, and powerful. As I closed my laptop, I thought about my grandmother and smiled. She would have been proud. And for the first time in 3 years, I looked forward to going to work in the morning. The next morning, I walked into the office with my head held high. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely in that building. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter, the air less suffocating. As I settled at my desk, I noticed several coworkers glancing my way, some with curiosity, others with newfound respect. Word travels fast in an office, especially when it involves someone like Sandra Collins being called out for her behavior. By lunchtime, Kevin stopped by my desk with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing one in front of me. "That took guts, what you did." I accepted the coffee with a smile. "Thanks." It wasn't about being brave, though. It was about being tired of feeling small. He nodded thoughtfully. "Well, whatever it was, things are already different around here. Did you notice how Sandra actually listened during the morning meeting? Like, really listened instead of just waiting for her turn to speak." I had noticed. Sandra had been subdued, still professional, but without the cutting remarks or dismissive sighs that usually punctuated our team discussions. She'd even acknowledged Diane's suggestion about the client presentation, something she would have normally shot down immediately. "It's a start," I said. "Let's see if it lasts." The changes in Sandra were subtle at first. She kept her distance, communicating mostly through email and brief, formal interactions during necessary meetings. I could feel her resentment simmering beneath the surface, but the open hostility was gone. The power dynamic had shifted, and we were both adjusting to the new reality. 2 weeks after the HR meeting, I received an email from Sandra requesting a one-on-one check-in. As agreed in our HR resolution, Janet would be present as a neutral third party. I prepared myself for potential backlash, rehearsing calm responses to whatever Sandra might throw at me. When I arrived at the conference room, Sandra was already seated with a folder of papers in front of her. Janet arrived moments later, offering us both a reassuring smile as she took her seat. "Thank you both for being here," Janet began. "The purpose of this meeting is to establish clear communication channels moving forward. Sandra has prepared some discussion points." I braced myself as Sandra opened her folder. "I've reviewed your current projects," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Based on your progress reports, it seems you've taken on additional responsibilities with the Westfield account." I nodded cautiously. "Yes, their scope expanded last month." "Your approach with them has been effective," Sandra continued, the admission clearly difficult for her. "The client specifically mentioned your responsiveness in their feedback." I blinked in surprise. Was this a compliment? "Thank you," I said, unsure how to respond to this unfamiliar territory. "I'd like to propose adjusting your role to officially include client relationship management for Westfield and similar accounts," Sandra said, sliding a document across the table. "This would come with a 12% salary increase and title change to Senior Account Specialist." I stared at the proposal, momentarily speechless. This wasn't at all what I had expected. Janet seemed equally surprised but quickly recovered. This is an excellent development. Melissa, would you like some time to review the details? Yes, please, I managed to say, still processing what was happening. Sandra's expression remained unreadable. Take the week to consider it. We can discuss any questions you have next Monday. As the meeting concluded, Sandra paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said without looking directly at me, the quality of your work has never been the issue. She left before I could respond, leaving me to wonder what exactly she meant by that cryptic comment. Had she recognized my competence all along, but chosen to belittle me anyway? Or was this promotion just a way to save face after being reprimanded? That evening, I called my sister to share the unexpected development. Sounds like classic damage control to me, Rachel said after I explained the situation. The company is trying to make sure you don't sue them. Maybe, I acknowledged. But the weird thing is, I think it was Sandra's idea, not HR's. Janet seemed surprised by the proposal. People do strange things when their backs are against the wall, Rachel said. Just be careful. A promotion doesn't erase 3 years of harassment. She was right, of course. I reviewed the promotion details with cautious optimism, looking for hidden catches or impossible expectations buried in the fine print. But the proposal was straightforward: more responsibility, better pay, and a clearer path to advancement. After careful consideration and a consultation with a labor attorney friend of Rachel's, I accepted the promotion. The attorney had confirmed that taking the new position wouldn't invalidate my harassment complaint or prevent me from taking further action if problems continued. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to my work life. My new role gave me more autonomy and direct client contact, which meant less daily interaction with Sandra. When we did work together, her approach was different, professional, focused on results, and noticeably free of personal attacks. I discovered that without the constant stress of anticipating Sandra's next cutting remark, I thrived. My client relationships strengthened, my creative problem-solving improved, and my confidence grew. The team dynamic shifted too, with other colleagues gradually becoming more outspoken in meetings, offering ideas without fear of humiliation. Sandra, meanwhile, was going through her own transformation. The mandatory management training seemed to be having an effect, though not always in comfortable ways. I overheard her once, arguing with the trainer after a session. "This is ridiculous," she was saying as I passed by the conference room. "You're telling me I need to consider people's feelings before telling them they've made a mistake? How does that prepare them for the real world?" The trainer's response was measured but firm. "The research is clear, Sandra. Constructive feedback delivered with respect produces better results than criticism delivered with contempt. That's not coddling, it's effective leadership." Sandra had no response to that, and I found myself wondering how many of her own managers had shaped her approach through their treatment of her. Not that it excused her behavior, but it helped me understand the cycle that needed to be broken. 3 months after my promotion, I was asked to participate in Sandra's follow-up review with HR and her supervisor, Thomas Parker, the department director. I entered the meeting with mixed feelings, pride in standing up for myself, but no desire to further damage Sandra's career if she was genuinely improving. Thomas opened the discussion. "Melissa, we'd like your honest assessment of how things have changed since the formal complaint. No sugarcoating, please. We need to know if the remediation plan is working." Sandra sat stiffly beside him, eyes fixed on the notepad in front of her. I chose my words carefully. There has been a significant improvement in our professional interactions. The hostile environment I documented previously no longer exists. Sandra has maintained appropriate boundaries and communication standards. Thomas nodded, making notes. "Any concerns about subtle retaliation or undermining behaviors?" "No," I replied honestly. "Our interactions are limited due to my new role. But when we do collaborate, the focus remains on the work rather than personal criticisms." Sandra's shoulders relaxed slightly, though she remained silent. That's helpful feedback, Thomas said. Sandra, would you like to add anything about your experience with the management training program? Sandra finally looked up, her expression a complex mixture of humility and determination. The program has been illuminating, she admitted. I've had to confront some uncomfortable truths about my leadership style and its impact on team performance and morale. She paused, then added something that stunned me. I owe Melissa an apology. My treatment of her was unprofessional and counterproductive. I mistook harshness for high standards, and in doing so, I created an environment where talented people couldn't do their best work. The silence that followed felt electric. I had never expected to hear Sandra acknowledge her behavior so directly, much less apologize for it. Thank you, Sandra, I said quietly. I appreciate that. Thomas seemed satisfied with the exchange. Based on all the feedback we've gathered, including this conversation, we believe the remediation plan has been effective. Sandra will continue with the advanced management training modules, and will conduct another review in 6 months. As we left the meeting, Sandra and I found ourselves alone in the hallway for a moment. I meant what I said in there, she said, looking me in the eye for the first time in months. I'm sorry for how I treated you. Can I ask you something? I ventured, seizing the rare moment of honesty between us. Why me? Why did you single me out for such harsh treatment? Sandra considered the question, her usual defensive armor nowhere in sight. Because you reminded me of myself at your age, she finally said. Talented, eager to please, emotional. I thought I was toughening you up for what I'd faced climbing the corporate ladder, making you stronger. By breaking me down? I asked, not accusingly but genuinely wanting to understand. That's how it was done to me, she replied simply. I didn't know another way until now. With that revelation hanging between us, we parted ways, each with a new understanding of the other. Not friends, not even close, but perhaps no longer enemies. The following Friday, at our monthly team happy hour, an event I had previously avoided due to Sandra's tendency to use it as another opportunity for public criticism, I noticed several former colleagues had shown up. Among them was Zoe, who had left the department 6 months earlier after a particularly brutal performance review from Sandra. Hey, stranger, she greeted me with a hug. Word on the street is you finally stood up to the dragon lady. I smiled uncomfortably. News travels fast. Are you kidding? You're a legend now, Zoe laughed, raising her glass. To Melissa, who did what the rest of us only dreamed about. I shook my head. I just documented what was happening and followed the proper channels. Which is exactly why it worked, said a voice behind me. I turned to find Thomas Parker, our department director, joining our conversation. Melissa's approach was thorough and professional. She gave HR exactly what they needed to address the situation. Zoe raised an eyebrow, and yet Sandra is still employed. People can change, I found myself saying, surprising even myself with the sentiment. The goal wasn't to destroy Sandra's career. It was to stop the toxic behavior. Thomas nodded approvingly. Exactly. And speaking of careers, he added, lowering his voice slightly, I've been very impressed with your work since your promotion, Melissa. The quarterly numbers for your client portfolio are outstanding. Thank you, I said, feeling a flush of pride. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you're not constantly walking on eggshells. Indeed, Thomas agreed, which is why I'd like to discuss a potential leadership opportunity with you. Sandra's management training has revealed that she's more suited to client strategy than personnel management. We're restructuring the department, and I think you have the right combination of skills and emotional intelligence to lead a team. I nearly choked on my drink. You want me to take over Sandra's team? Part of it, Thomas clarified. We're creating smaller, more specialized units. You'd start with 3 direct reports, focusing on our mid-sized client relationships. Sandra would transition to a senior strategist role without management responsibilities. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of Sandra telling me I was too emotional to advance, my so-called weakness, my empathy, and emotional intelligence was now being recognized as a leadership strength. I'd need to think about it, I said honestly. Management is a big responsibility. Of course, Thomas replied. Take the weekend. We can talk details on Monday. As he walked away, Zoe stared at me in amazement. Did he just offer you Sandra's job? Not exactly, I said, still processing the conversation, but close. That night, as I considered Thomas's offer, I thought about how dramatically my professional life had changed in just a few months. From dreading each workday to being considered for a leadership role, all because I'd finally found the courage to speak up. I also thought about Sandra and our brief moment of honesty in the hallway. Her admission that she'd been treating me the way she'd been treated earlier in her career had struck a chord. How many other toxic workplace behaviors were simply handed down from one generation to the next, like poisonous heirlooms. By breaking that cycle, by documenting the behavior and insisting on accountability instead of either suffering in silence or leaving the company, I had not only changed my own situation, but potentially improved the work environment for everyone on the team. The following Monday, I accepted Thomas's offer with one condition. I wanted to work with HR to develop a mentorship program for new managers, focusing on constructive feedback techniques and emotional intelligence in leadership. Thomas enthusiastically agreed, seeing the value in preventing future situations like mine. Sandra and I continued to work for the same company, but in very different capacities. Her role as senior strategist played to her analytical strengths without putting her in position to damage other employees' self-worth. My new role as team leader allowed me to create the supportive, respectful environment I had always wished for as an employee. 6 months into my management position, I received an unexpected email from Sandra with a subject line that simply read, "Thank you." The body of the email was brief. I've been reflecting on my career, especially since the changes last year. While I wouldn't have chosen this path, I'm finding the strategic work more satisfying than I expected. Without the constant personnel issues, I'm producing better work. I believe you inadvertently did me a favor. The management skills you insisted I learn have made me a more effective collaborator, even without direct reports. I still don't agree with all your methods or perspectives, but I recognize that your actions ultimately led to better outcomes for the department and for me. SC. I read the email twice, marveling at how far we'd both come. It wasn't a warm and fuzzy reconciliation, but it was honest acknowledgement from a woman who had once seemed incapable of self-reflection. I replied simply, "Growth rarely comes without discomfort. I'm glad we've both found roles that allow us to contribute our best work." Melissa. As I hit send, I thought about all the tears I'd shed over Sandra's treatment, the nights I'd questioned my own competence, the mornings I dreaded going to work, the constant tension that had affected my health and happiness. Those tears hadn't been a weakness, as Sandra had claimed. They'd been a natural human response to unjust treatment. The real weakness would have been continuing to accept that treatment as inevitable or deserved. The lesson I carry forward as a leader is this: emotional intelligence isn't about never crying. It's about recognizing when something is wrong and having the courage to address it. It's about standing up not just for yourself, but for the kind of workplace where everyone can thrive. Last week, a junior member of my team came to me with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by a challenging project and a difficult client. Instead of telling her she cried too easily, I handed her a tissue, listened to her concerns, helped her develop a solution, and thanked her for trusting me enough to be vulnerable. The cycle was broken, and in its place a new pattern was forming, one of respect, empathy, and true professional growth. Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't just about personal vindication. It's about creating ripples that change the entire culture around you. My tears didn't make me weak. They made me human. And my refusal to accept mistreatment didn't just help me. It helped create a better workplace for everyone, including the woman who once made me cry. The lawsuit that never actually happened, the one Sandra feared when she broke down in that HR meeting, accomplished more than any court verdict could have. It transformed not just my career, but Sandra's too. And perhaps most importantly, it ensured that the next generation of employees wouldn't have to document years of mistreatment before being treated with basic dignity and respect. That's a victory worth every tear.